Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Equity Lab. My name is Sonrisa Cooper. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a program manager here at Greenlining, where I work on systems change. We're so excited to have you here with us for day 2 of our economic summit. So the reason we call this session Equity Lab is because it's meant to be a little more interactive than your typical online panel. So we're actually calling it a roundtable. We have 2 breakout sessions happening at the same time where we'll be exploring ways to recover from the pandemic with equity in mind. I know it's really hard to feel connected when you've been sitting behind a screen for over a year. So we try to design this session so that the audience can participate. So we have invited some guests to join us today, but we've also made it possible for audience members to join the discussion. So later on, we'll invite you to hop on stage if you're interested and actually join and be a part of the panel for a few minutes. This is our first time ever trying something like this, so please be flexible and also help us out by participating in the discussion, coming on stage, and using the chat while we're talking. So as you know, the theme of this year's Economic Summit is momentum, and that's what we want to get into today. We know that we can't go back to normal when COVID is gone. In 2019, before this pandemic even started, the typical white family had 8 times the wealth of a typical Black family and 5 times the wealth of a typical Latino family. And since then, that's only gotten worse. During the pandemic, 60% of Black families, 72% of Latino families, and 55% of Indigenous families reported serious financial problems, compared to just 36% of white families. I'm sure many of us here have experienced this personally. It's just not an option for us to keep the status quo. And of course, it's not just a financial issue either. During the pandemic, we've also borne collective witness to horrendous police brutality, waves of anti-Asian hate crimes, and if you live in the American West, I don't think any of us will forget what it felt like to have wildfire smoke blocking the sun for weeks on end. And of course, we've lost millions of friends and loved ones because of a health crisis that could have been prevented if our government cared more about Black and Brown people. Things have been hard for our communities for a really long time, and we don't want to go back to that either, but we also can't forget about it. As I mentioned earlier, we're here today to talk about momentum. Things have been really, really rough, but actually not everything has been bad news. Over the past year, we've seen record voter turnout in spite of a global pandemic and efforts to suppress voters of color. We've seen an incredible swell of racial justice activism and organizing. And in general, I think we've just all really learned new ways to communicate and show how much we care about each other. So COVID will go away, but everything is going to be a little bit different after the pandemic ends. This isn't just a moment, we're part of a movement. And we need to imagine what we could do and create if we weren't afraid to think really big about how we want to change our society. Okay, so now I want to just backtrack a little bit to talk about why we need to be big and bold in our response to the COVID pandemic. So this map is probably familiar to most of you already, and you've probably seen it a lot during this conference, but this is really important. So this is the redlining map of Oakland from 1937. It was created by a government agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And on it, the red and yellow areas on the map represent neighborhoods where people of color lived. The blue and green represent the areas where white people lived. So these maps were created by the government for cities all over the country, and they were used by banks to decide where they would issue mortgages to home buyers. So residents of the red and yellow neighborhoods, that is, people of color, were effectively shut out of homeownership for decades, leading to the enormous racial wealth gap that I mentioned earlier. And now I want to show you something else. So this is that redlining map of Oakland again. This is a map of air pollution in the same area. And this is a map of where COVID-19 was hitting us worst a few months ago. They all look the same, right? So the reason these maps all look the same is because they all stem from the same root cause, which is structural racism. It's not just a housing issue. It's not an environmental issue. It's not a health issue. It's actually intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression that together form a system of structural racism. So these maps are the products of what at Greenlining we call the redlined economy. And the redlined economy is a broken economy. It is extractive of our planet. It's segregated. It doesn't protect workers. It harms our communities. The redlined economy is bad. And what we want is a just and healthy economy. And we call this a greenlined economy. This is our North Star. A greenlined economy is inclusive. It's democratic. It's cooperative. It's regenerative. And it's non-exploitative. And most importantly, a greenlined economy keeps community at the center. So I know this sounds like a pretty lofty vision, but we're actually very optimistic that we can create this. It definitely won't happen overnight. It'll take patience and resolve. And most importantly, we'll need people from every corner of our system to buy into our vision of a greenlined economy. We'll need to build power. We need to organize, educate ourselves and each other, and work in solidarity towards a greenline system. If you've been organizing for a long time, you already know this is a very long fight. And if you felt the call to action for the first time this year, please don't walk away. At the same time, we also need to make sure that policy has equity written into it. We need racial equity in the halls of power. We need funders on board with the vision. And we need to set the bar really high for what we expect from our institutions. Like I said, it'll take everybody working towards a just and healthy economy for it to take root. The past year has been awful in so many ways. We are living through a dark chapter in history, but there's also a little crack in the door with some light peeking through. And I am ready to kick the door wide open. I'm ready to talk about what's on the other side of the door and imagine what we can do to build a brighter and healthier future for our communities. So in just a little bit, we're going to get into the more exciting part of this session. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to explore what it'll take for our economy to bounce back from COVID with equity at the core. So we have two breakouts happening at the same time. One is called Building Power, and the other is called Policy in Action. You're already in one of those breakout rooms, but if you want to switch back and forth, you can do that as much as you want by clicking the Sessions tab on the left side of the screen. So in each of these rooms, we're going to have this conversation roundtable style. We've invited some incredible speakers here to talk with us about creating a just and healthy economy. Our speakers today are organizers, activists, radical thinkers, leaders in government, just all around brilliant people. And as I said, this is an interactive session, so you will also have an opportunity to jump in. We want to see your thoughts in the chat, your questions in the box, and in a little bit, you'll even have the chance to get up on stage with us and join the dialogue with the speakers if you want to. We've all sat through so many Zoom panels this year. This is different. We want you to be able to participate. So don't think of it like a Q&A. Think of it more like a conversation or coming on a talk show. So if you're feeling brave, you can raise your hand to join the discussion, and one of our moderators will bring you up on stage to join the guests. And don't feel self-conscious if you are not camera ready. We've all been there. And I promise this is a totally judgment-free zone. We just want to get more people on the mic. Like I said, we've never tried this before, so I hope you are open to trying something new together. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Brianna Wells, who's in the Building Power session, and Leslie Aguayo, who's in the Policy and Action session, and they are going to take it away with the roundtable conversations.
So the theme of this session is building power, how to galvanize the momentum of the current moment to organize for a new just future after COVID and not just a return to the status quo. And we know that the road to recovery is multifaceted and has to address issues beyond the economic crisis caused by COVID. It's about climate justice, racial justice, health justice, and even electoral justice, as we've seen over the last year. And the people who know this very well are those who are organizing communities and building community power. And on this note about building power, I want to emphasize that even though we have 2 sessions happening right now, this one and policy and action, policy and organizing are definitely not separate levels to build the green-lined economy that Sonrisa mentioned at the beginning. We also know that there isn't just one way to build power. There are roles to play all over the ecosystem, and the work can't be done alone. It truly takes a village. So that is why I'm really excited that we brought together this really dope panel of speakers today, and introduce them real quick, but then I'll let them tell you more about themselves later when we get into it. So first off, we have Michelle Mascarenhas-Swan from Movement Generation. Michelle works on the organization's Just Transition training and strategy, and has worked for the last 25 years building movement vehicles for frontline communities to move a shared strategy. Welcome, Michelle. We also have Alberto Retana, President and CEO of Community Coalition, an organization based in LA that empowers residents to transform their communities. Alberto has developed initiatives to build Community Coalition into a mass-based community organization that involves thousands of South LA residents in creating change. Welcome, Alberto. Last but certainly not least, we have Wang, Associate Director of Capacity Building here at Greenlining. She leads the environmental equity team's locally based work, helping build the capacity of communities of color to access state-level resources to fight the impacts of pollution and climate change. So thank you all so much for being here with us today. Before we start, I'm just gonna give another rundown. So how this is gonna work is that we're gonna hear from you all lovely panelists for the first couple of questions, and then I'm gonna invite some folks from the audience to join in the conversation, and I will also for the audience, feel free to jump in sessions. You can click on the sessions tab, which I believe is on the left of your screen, to get to the other breakout room. And as for the panelists, totally feel free to ask questions of each other. I just want this to be as free-flowing as possible. So with that, I'd love to get the ball rolling. And this first question is for everyone, but I was thinking maybe Emmy could kick us off. So could each of you tell us a little bit about you, your work and your background, and explain in your words, why is building power and being in community important, particularly in this moment?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, happy to kick it off. And so happy to be on stage with Brianna, who is my colleague and coworker, very exciting. And so happy to share the stage with Michelle and Alberto, who are like titans. So feeling very, very lucky and honored right to your question. So yes, my work, I've always conceived of my work as supporting communities of color to achieve self-determination, right? I think we live in a world where our communities have been structurally divested of power, land, resources, autonomy. And so bringing back that autonomy and ownership is so important, right? And I think we heard yesterday all the incredible speakers, and especially Isabel Wilkerson breaking it down. Like, this is structurally, we live in a society where we are disinvested of power. So power building is the goal. Like, power building is the name of the game, 100. So just to talk about our work, so here at Greenlining, right, we're a policy and advocacy organization. We do statewide level work, and we work with 2 amazing policy teams focused on climate equity and economic equity, essentially working to change the structures so that all of our communities can thrive. And I think what we found in doing that work over the years is sometimes our most kind of under-resourced communities of color, they don't even have the capacity to engage with the policy level like work that we are pushing for, right? Marginalized communities, by very definition, are communities who don't have the same amount of capacity, resources, the same amount of like social infrastructure, technical infrastructure. So recognizing that gap, right? And like recognizing we have to work at the structural, but we also have to support communities to achieve their full potential. I'm helping to lead a new team here at Greenlining focused on capacity building, right? And what this means is capacity building for communities of color so that they can engage with policies, they can bring down resources and investment, collaboratives and coalitions, and ultimately build power. So just as a really tangible example, I don't want to go on too long, but just to like ground what this looks like. So we've been working in South Stockton for the past 4 or 5 years. And that work really began with a really humble goal. It was to like spread awareness about Over the years, that has led to this past June, South Stockton and the city of Stockton receiving a $10.8 million grant to make foundational improvements in solar, energy efficiency, street trees, healthy produce for families, streetscape improvements, like these really foundational improvements to improve the environment and to improve quality. And I think our role as Greenlining has been to serve as a little bit of a catalyst, right? Helping to convene partners specifically around environmental justice and climate equity, supporting with strategy development and facilitation, mediating some relationships between the city and community-based stakeholders, right? We know those are tough. Technical assistance. And then when it comes to like power building, right? This work is about the work of the collective. Like over the lifetime, over the past 4 or 5 years, this work is the sum of so many different folks working together, right? There have been, I would say, 10 to 20 core like partners over the past 5 years. I think some of them were here, like, oh my God, Fathers and Families, Little Manila, Third City, Public Health Advocates, Rising Sun, Edible Schoolyards, I'm gonna miss people, but like just so many amazing folks who are organizing residents, better understanding what community needs and what community vision is, leveraging skills and talents, and like working together to make it happen. So I think this is, to me, like why we do this work is to see both the tangible like benefits, right? Like that $10.8 million grant is huge. It's a huge win. It's like tangible, it's immediate, it's huge. And maybe even more importantly, right, folks are building power with each other. Now there is a like burgeoning EJ coalition, environmental justice coalition in South Stockton called Rise Stockton that did not exist before. Like those relationships and that power did not exist 2 years ago. So that's why I'm really psyched to support this work, because that's the goal, is to support local transformation.
Thank you. Thank you. Alberto, maybe, do you want to take a stab at it next?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, and it's really cool to see everybody and to see everyone's names and the amount of people that hopefully I can build relationships with after this. So thank you so much. I'm Alberto. My name is Alberto. I work at Community Coalition. It's a organization that we consider to be a mass-based people's organization in South Central Los Angeles. Our mission is to transform the social and economic conditions that foster addiction, crime, violence, and poverty by building a community institution that involves thousands of people in creating, influencing, and changing public policy. So it's about root causes, it's about building community institutions owned by the people and by involving thousands of folks in impacting policy. We were created in 1990 by Congressmember Karen Bass in response to the crack epidemic that was devastating communities across the country, in particular to provide a people's response to the crisis, because the crisis was being responded with arms, with militarized police forces, and in Los Angeles we had a very, very crazy chief of police who basically said that Black folks need to be held down by their necks because they were constructed differently. So it was a very similar themes to today, but there was very little organization on the ground. Our founder employed community organizing as the primary strategy for going about change. From her vantage point, when they started the organization, they had a lot of ideas on what needed to be done to address the crack crisis. But what they decided to do was to do mass engagement in the community. We knocked on 10,000 doors. We talked to 10,000 family members to identify what were the primary issues that people were identifying, and what the founders of the organization thought was very different from what the community thought. In fact, the number one issue that the community brought up over and over and over and over again was the overabundance of liquor stores. Yet a lot of activists at the time were really pushing decriminalization and legalization. People on the ground were calling for the alleviation of these liquor stores that were serving as hotbeds of crime and nuisance in their communities. So that became the essential strategy that we've employed year after year after year, which is to do mass engagement, mass political education, and then mass campaigns to impact change. Most recently, in 2017, on the 25th anniversary of the civil unrest or the LA uprising, we had 4,500 conversations, face-to-face conversations with people, 30-minute conversations to find out, again, what are the things that you care about? What are the things you'd like to see changed? What has moved and what hasn't moved if you've been here for the last 25 years? And through that, we developed a platform called the People's Platform. So that's essentially our model of organizing. It's essentially the process of bringing people together with shared values, shared concerns to change policy. I think also part of that process is building connection between people. That's as important almost as, if not more, than changing policy, and to help folks fundamentally believe that they have the power to change conditions. But to power, I just wanted to at least close this out by noting that feeling empowered is not the same as having power. And today's conversation is about power and why is power so important. I believe that one of the greatest myths of policy change is a silver bullet approach to change that says that it's about good ideas, that Green's about change. It's about smart people. It's about visionaries. It's about organized data and research. It's about compelling stories. It's about who you know. All of those things are factors, but at the end of the day, that's not the decision-making factor in why change is ultimately moved. And I think that a lot of us in the work that do policy oftentimes get seduced by the notion if we just put the best report out, if we just had the best ideas, if we just had the right relationship with that person, then we could really move this policy forward. I think that's a really dangerous road to take, and we all have to remind ourselves that ultimately, while all those are important, the most significant factor in advancing the structural social change that we're all looking for, the kind that really gets at the racial inequalities, the kind that really unearth the anti-Black racism in our institutions, is a function of power. And without power, it's less likely to have your stories heard. It's less likely for your data to be taken seriously. It's less likely that your good idea will be paid attention to. Of course, there's exceptions. You can always find that one YouTuber that got 10 million views. Or we can always point to our leaders and be like, God, we have a visionary leader. Thank the Lord we have a visionary leader. But ultimately, the most fundamental form of power is when masses of people get together and fight for justice. And that's what we've been noticing over the last year with the Black Lives Matter movement. It's what we've noticed over the last decade with the climate justice movement, immigrant rights movement. All of these different movements are ultimately about masses of people putting pressure on a system that wasn't designed to serve us, to transform that system. So that's ultimately why I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. That's how we think about power, and community organizing is a vehicle to not just build power, but express it. Because we can't just be in the process of building up our muscles if we're not going to use it for something, and that's expressing that power for justice. Thank you for having me, Brianna.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm with Movement Generation, but I actually was born and raised in Southern California. Grew up in LA and worked on food issues in schools in the 90s, organizing students and food service workers, some teachers and others to transform or at least fight for the transformation of school food in cafeterias in the LA Unified School District and other districts around Southern California. And I got to work with the Community Coalition, who, as Alberto was saying, was fighting against the preponderance of liquor store and also the dearth and scarcity and like systematic disinvestment of supermarkets, like the redlining of supermarkets and the kinds of food that were put in the same Ralph's grocery store in South LA versus in West LA, and so I think, yeah, it's just from that work, though, I think what I've learned most is that, our movements have been really good at resisting, and we always know that we have to build at the same time, right? This system is not going to build the kinds of infrastructure or ways to take care of our peoples that are rooted in care, cooperation, mutuality, all the things that we saw in the opening slideshow, right? Regeneration rather than exploitation and extraction. And so, that power has to be wielded as self-determination in a way that is building what we need in ways that actually start to take down and dismantle this system. So, I've been blessed to be a part of this collective movement generation, and then we co-founded with 20 plus other organizations back in 2012, the Climate Justice Alliance. And, that alliance has been a real force for kind of transforming the way we think about climate, right? That it's not, as we're all saying here on this panel and, in this momentum, is that it's all intersectional, right? It's all connected. If our communities don't have land and we don't have the capital to make our labor productive, then we are beholden to extractive and exploitative systems that are just. And so, it's been exciting to be a part of a movement that is forging a vision for a regenerative economy and for a just transition. And I think in particular in this moment, it's been really thinking about like, how do we learn from and think about the ways that communities on the front lines have always built their power to meet needs collectively, so through mutual aid, through, mamas taking care and sharing burdens when there's too much for any one person, right? We know the heteropatriarchal nuclear family does not work. And, those who have faced that the worst have been, Black women, mamas in particular, Native women, like ways to do this better and differently. And so just like starting with the ground infrastructure and what our communities have always learned to survive and strengthening and building those into permanently organized communities that are also, to the point of the former speakers, right, at the same and fighting for systemic transformation. We're building the infrastructure that we need.
Yes. Wow. Yes. Thank you all for those really thoughtful responses and doing, some sort of level setting for us. I'm hearing you all kind of talk about similar themes that this work involves, like strengthening relationships and connections within communities, which sometimes involves thousands of folks. And I really liked what you said, Alberto, about making people believe that they have the power to make change. And that sort of leads me into my second question, which is kind of about mobilization. And I'd really like to hear your perspectives on movement building right now. And so I'm not sure if any of you tuned into the fireside chat yesterday on the first day of Summit, but we got to hear from Ense, who is an organizer and CEO of the New Georgia Project. And she talked a lot about the wins that they saw in Georgia last year with voter turnout and getting, to, I think, a lot of people surprised, 2 really progressive Democrats elected to the Senate. And of course, that was on a large scale, but it kind of got me thinking about all of the mobilization that happened last year, because there's definitely been a lot. And Movement for Black Lives, to just name one example, really held it down in terms of establishing local presences all over the country, political education for framing this moment. And so this question could be for all of you. I'm curious, maybe Michelle could get us going on it, but I know that the concept of power building is really broad, but my question is, how has the context of COVID-19 and the increased momentum behind ending police violence shaped the strategies or the values behind your power building efforts?
Yeah, one thing that I think it's showing us and reminding us is that we're in a very different moment than we were 10, 20, 50 years ago, right? And our movements need to be positioning ourselves differently because of that, right? So in part because the ecological crisis, like because of 500 years of genocide, mass displacement, colonization, land theft, has led to the evisceration of the Earth's life support systems. Margins are scarcer and scarcer, right? And so we're seeing shocks and slides more and more. So slides are like, we're not going to wake up one morning and see the sea rise 6 feet, but it'll be slow, right? We'll feel it in the flatlands through, sewage systems backing up at what are much more frequent storms, right? What used to be a 100-year storm happening every winter, but also shocks, and not just, these are ecological shocks, right? When peoples are being murdered, that is ecological, right? Humans are part of nature, like we are part of this web of life. And so system bring down on particularly Black bodies, Black peoples and communities, in order to control more and more certain communities that, which is part of, like, if we're heading to, I think everybody knows climate change is real. We all kind of see the apocalypse unfolding. It's either just transition or it's eco-apartheid. And we're seeing how that's playing out through increasing militarization. And so these shocks, like we've been seeing increasingly, are gonna pop off more and more as well. And so I think, what we saw, like Brianna, to your point about the way that the Movement for Black Lives organized translocally, right? So our power is built first and foremost where we live, where we are. And like, to the point of this technology working kind of not necessarily sometimes, to our benefit, sometimes not. In India, they're just shutting down in Colombia and, places where our peoples are rising up. The government just shuts down the internet, right? Or shuts down Twitter, or shuts down the ways that people
engage. So it's critical that we understand and are organizing locally through relationships, but then also
translocally, right? So shared strategies, like, shared actions, as well as shared framing, as well as a unified vision of where we're heading. Those are some of, I think, the key unifying forces of a power building strategy in this moment, where we're understanding that even if we're feeling slightly different shocks and slides in different places, we know where we're going, and we're not going to be bought off by body cameras or whatever the, possible, because we have an end goal, and it's about self-determination.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate that response. Do either of you want to comment before we open it up to the audience?
Michelle just said it so well. I'm just taking the wisdom that she was able to provide in terms of just, we are facing overlapping crises, right? Crises of inequality, crises of climate, crises of increased authoritarianism of the state and police brutality. And I think it's a moment of, it's a moment of reckoning, but it's also a moment of hope, I think, right? I think what we are seeing over this past year is that against the powers of the state, and also against rising levels of seas and heat and fire, against all of that, for me, it's a moment of both, just reckoning with that, but also I think we have seen how resilient we are as communities, and how resilient and how important it is to build long-lasting, durable community infrastructure. Right? Both Michelle and Alberto talked about that, right? The way we build resiliency is not just, but it's really the long-term relationships and trust, and hey, you're my neighbor, there's a blackout, let me help you out. Those are the ways that we build in these webs of resiliency, and the need to build locally, because that's where all these crises are impacting us. So just double tapping on Michelle's words.
Yes.
I guess I might, I appreciate all that's been shared and being reflective and processing with you all. As we think about sort of the moment and the movement, both the moment that we're in terms of, as Grace Lee Boggs would say, the clock of the world and where we are on it, but also the movement that we're in. A few thoughts. One, just important to remind everybody, ourselves and those that we work with, that movements don't come out of thin air. And whether you've been at this for 25 years or you just walked in, all of us tend to sometimes forget that. I remember even how, as a student, learning about revolutionary movements of the 60s, that's like, oh wow, like as if that just happened, when it took a decade, 2 decades of work. And so there's just a lot of groundwork that's been done over the last 2 decades to get us where we are today that allows us to seize the moment. So we're just continuing to honor and center those voices, because if and when the movement goes down, those organizations and efforts will continue to sustain the drive. So I just think a lot of that is a really important part, because we can't just think about what's here, but what's 10 years from now, what's 25 years from now, where are we going to be 100 years from now. I think the other important lesson for me around the moment that we're in terms of the movement questions for us, is this is a real opportunity for self-examination for our people. And so one thing for me, as an example, around self-examination as it relates to race and racial justice, is to constantly actually, through disciplined and aggressive approach, root out anti-Black racism in the non-Black Latino community. So we can take all we want and focus on white supremacy and capitalism and all this great work, but if we're not willing, we can speak, I can talk about the anti-Asian hate and all these other things, but at the end of the day, what am I doing in my own community to root out the way in which is of white supremacy? And I think that's a really important opportunity. And one of the doors that has opened up is that we're actually more aggressively looking at anti-Black racism in the non-Black Latino community as an example, to really build community, to really build understanding, to really root out what can get in the way of real success. Because if we don't root out anti-Black racism as a Latino community over time, what does that mean for the United States? What does that mean for democracy? What does that mean for the changes we're fighting to implement? Last thing I'll say on this particular subject around COVID and the movement around state-sanctioned violence and Black Lives Matter, I just think it's an incredibly powerful moment that we're in, that BLM has really put on the table for us to take to the next level, and that is people-driven. Clearly, the ways in which we've seen people killed over and over and over and over again, on the one hand, as traumatic as it is, I feel like because of the reaction, I worry at times that we get lulled into the belief that, oh, like there's no way this generation's gonna ultimately change things, but yet we still have so many people voting for really racist folks. We have very young people out shooting and killing folks that are Asian, that are Black. All that stuff is really problematic. So we have to really double down on making sure that we organize folks. And what I think COVID did in relation to that is COVID began to remove the veil across communities that don't experience oppression in a way that doubled down with what people are seeing on TV. That is forcing people to ask themselves, is this the society I want to live in? Is this the world I want to live in? And the opportunity that everyone's been talking about, at least in terms of the rhetoric, is do we go back to what we were, or we do something different? That's the crossroads that we're in, and it's kind of hard to think about what to build different when we're just trying to get people back together. But I think that's one of the greatest challenges we have in front of us, is moving forward over the next 10 years. How do we make sure we just don't go back, and that we keep pushing harder and harder and harder? And I know that it's easy conceptually to answer that question, and it's something that we might talk about around the dinner tables, but in practice, without power, without a real political program, it's a much more difficult process to advance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that momentum piece, honestly. And so now I think it would be a good time to bring in some audience members. I'd love to hear from you all, reflections, any questions you have for our speakers. But before we do that, I want to set some ground rules real quick. So for the audience, to request to come on stage, you'll use the hand raising function at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll bring you up here to tell us a little bit about who you are and what questions or comments you have for the panelists. And we're running a little bit short on time, so we're going to invite you to stay up here for a few minutes to hang out with the panelists. So don't feel like you have to leave after asking your question or giving your comments. This is supposed to be just casual. It can be casual, more informal, so don't be shy. And I know y'all know this, but please remember to be respectful of our panelists and other members in the session. That includes like staying on topic. I know that there are a lot of potential layers to this, but we want to make sure we stay grounded in the values of racial equity. And there's other ways to engage as well by using the Q&A function in the chat. So with that, yeah, if you want to come up here, you can request and I'll bring you up. Any takers? Oh yes, you can join by clicking the Ask to Share Audio and Video. That's what you click.
Come hang out with us. We want to see your faces.
Yeah. Like Sonrisa said, don't worry if you're not camera ready. It's okay. Also, I hope you all can't hear the construction happening. I hope it's not distracting. No? Okay. Cool.
And people can also just comment, right? They don't have to ask us a question. We have,
yeah.
Right? Yeah?
Yeah. It can be anything.
Cool.
We just want it to be interactive. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Okay, there's a question in the chat. This would love to hear any thoughts about how policy and advocacy-oriented organizations can transfer technical expertise to communities, work ourselves out of a job, so to speak.
Yeah.
Emmy, I feel like you could kind of speak to that.
Yeah, can I start? I mean, this is a great question. So thanks, Amelia. I hope I pronounced your name right. But yeah, this is a great question. And it's a big one, right? Because I think working with is that, yeah, we need to get ready, right? To be owners of our own policies in our own neighborhoods. So I would want to expand your question, right? From just technical capacity to overall capacity. Because I think technical skills and knowledge is one thing. And it's like, there's so much that needs to happen before that in terms of just like bringing up the overall staffing, like the expertise, the like just bandwidth to engage on issues, right? I think I would imagine all of us here in this room have 8 million things on our plate, and it's hard to even devote attention else that's extraneous, right? So I think one way for us our solution is to focus specifically on technical assistance and capacity building, right? I think it's something that's often thought of as ancillary because it's not the policy win, or it's like not directly connected to the goal, but it is so. And so what that means is developing long-term relationships with communities. So it's a relational and not transactional relationship, right? We are building long-term bonds so that us as a policy organization and in the local community that we're working with and that we're serving, we have like a mutual relationship in which we actually understand what are the goals here, what are the gaps, what's the vision, what's the community vision that y'all are working towards. And then in the context of that long-term relationship, I think it's about like providing a couple of things, right? So one is for sure just like the provision of like technical knowledge and doing train the trainer approach, like doing curriculums and workshop pieces that, transfer expertise and knowledge. But then a lot of it, I think, is around building a catalyst, like building a container and supporting a container for collective work. So whether that's an existing coalition or collaborative that's already existing locally or something brand new, I think this work is much like multiple bodies in a room, like multiple entities carrying that knowledge and expertise, as opposed to just like being dependent on one. So it's about building the overall capacity of the collective. And then, facilitating, I think, like peer exchange, just that like that intangible to solve a problem. So yeah, that would be kind of my thoughts. It's like building long-term relationships and then like engaging in specific technical expertise. And then the other thing too is then at a structural level, breaking down the structures that prevent us from access to to institutions of higher learning, like places where our communities sometimes are not welcome, right? So it's doing both of the work on both of those levels at once. Yeah, I think I probably have more to say on that, but I'm going to stop now to see if, Michelle.
Yeah.
I'd love to
thank
add.
you.
I'd love to add to that a little bit. I think I appreciate the question, and three thoughts on that. First, I think I would maybe reverse the question: is how do we build the capacity of policy and advocacy organizations to listen to and be driven by folks from the ground? I think is a really important piece, because we've oftentimes focusing on building the capacity of everyday people, when it's actually not the capacity of everyday people that need to be built. In fact, they have the answers, they have the vision, they have what they don't have is the vehicle, right? Or the support behind them. So this is the first question. The second thing I would say around on the capacity question is oftentimes, I think these advocacy policy organizations need to ask themselves, where do you derive your vision, strategies, solutions from? Is it from your own ideas? Is it from your degrees, your academic institutions, the data you've collected, your colleagues? Or is it coming from those lived experiences, those directly impacted by the problems we seek to change? Oftentimes advocates who come from these very lived experiences forget that because it's their experience, they then advocate on themselves, but forget to include everybody else in the process that is directly impacted, that does not have the opportunity, that did not have that lucky break to get to where they are through the hard work. So I think part of it is also asking ourselves, where do we derive our vision solutions from? And if you're finding yourself in I remember one of the things I learned from our founder when I started working is I came in, I was like, oh, we're gonna radicalize South Central. We got to get people involved. She's like, have you even had a conversation with folks? When you're at the grocery store and you're in line, do you talk to the person next to you? The most significant tool of the organizer is not the answer, but the question, because the question is going to give you the answers that you didn't even realize people knew, because we just become so patronizing in the approach when oftentimes it's just there if we have that. So we got to think about asking the right question. Last but not least, so something practical for policy, it kind of goes with what Emmy said around relationships. Identify a community organization. If there is not one in your region, there are plenty in California, I'll tell you that much. But if you don't know of one, please contact us and we can connect you to a community organizing institution either in your region, or we'd love to talk to a community coalition about how to do it. And there's plenty of advocacy groups like AP California, for instance, that does a pretty good job of making sure that their data, Greenlining, right, make sure their data is rooted in actual people. So those are just three thoughts I wanted to add to the mix.
Yes. Thank you, all of you. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. You know, tech issues, man. What can you do? And I'm sorry to the few people in the queue who did want to come up, but thank you everyone in the audience for participating in the chat. And thank you so much to our amazing thoughts from our speakers. And so I think in a few seconds, we're going to turn it back over to Sonrisa to give some closing remarks. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you all for joining us today. We had some really incredible conversations in both of those breakout sessions. This was fantastic. I just want to give a shout out to our incredible moderators, Brianna Wells and Leslie Aguayo, for leading these fantastic conversations. Thank you to our guests, Yana Garcia, Destiny Thomas, Alberto Retana, and Michelle Mascarenhas-Swan for sharing their brilliance with us. And to our Greenlining staff members, Emmy Wang and Rawan El-Halabi, for joining our guests up on stage. And of course, a huge thank you and round of applause to all of you in the audience today, especially the brave souls out there who joined the roundtables with our speakers. I hope you leave this virtual room feeling like you learned something new and that you feel ready to take a big step into the work of building a just and healthy economy together. Next, we're going to take a break where DJ Ome will be playing music. And then I hope you'll join us for the final session of this conference, where our Vice President of Policy, Alvaro Sanchez, We'll be moderating a conversation with Angela Glover-Blackwell and Michael Tubbs about radically reimagining our future and transforming our society to one that delivers true racial equity. It's going to be a great conversation. So thank you again for joining, and see you in the closing plenary session.